the village of Harlem in New York City, the world-famous Apollo Theater, where dreams are born and legends are made, is proud to present its showtime at the Apollo.
Welcome to Industry TV Network. Make sure you hit the like button, share, and subscribe. The legendary Apollo Theater. Who can forget that? Especially if you grew up in New York City. But during the 70s, the Apollo Theater in the heart of Harlem, New York City, faced financial trouble and were forced to shut the theater down for over 2 years. However, a mysterious buyer stepped in and saved the iconic venue. The new owner was none other than Guy Fisher. Although in an interview Nicky Barnes said, "We bought the Apollo," word on the street was the buyer and sole owner was Guy Fisher, who was known as a notorious heroin kingpin. Guy Fisher wasn't your average drug dealer. In August of 1969, he attended FIT, the Accredited Fashion Design Institute in New York City, studying textile administration as his major. He stated that attending college at FIT was an experience worth having due to the many young women he had access to. After Guy spent several months on trial for murder and walked away a free man due to a hung jury, he decided to give something back to the people of Harlem to make amends for his past deeds. He purchased the Apollo Theater, which had been closed for 3 years. He then refurbished the historic theater from top to bottom. On opening night in May of 1978, Ralph McDonald stepped onto the stage and welcomed a full house to the theater. The applause and the standing ovation the audience gave was enhanced when Ralph announced that a black man now owned the Apollo. It wasn't until Guy saw a few elderly people crying and clapping and yelling, "God bless him," that he finally realized the history of the place and the meaning behind their tears. At one point in time, a black person wasn't even allowed to work on the same street as the theater, let alone own it. The theater represented one of the few things we could share as a people, and that was the legendary list of black entertainers who had performed there. Guy took pride in being a part of the Apollo's new beginning and its new life. The Apollo grossed $1 million in the first year. In 1977, while Guy, Nick, and the 13 others were on trial together, that is when he purchased the theater. At the time, everyone thought Guy was crazy, especially Nick. But Guy felt like no one seemed to know or even understand him, and the fact that he didn't know how to give up or how to accept the thought of defeat, even about him being convicted. As the owner of the Apollo Theater, he made his older brother, whom everyone called Coco, the president of the company. He made his mother and his youngest sister, Florence, vice president and secretary. He said the most profound person he met at the theater was Millie Jackson. He claimed Millie Jackson, the singer, entertainer, actress, was the most outspoken female he had ever known personally. The first time Guy met Millie was at the Apollo. Millie had rented the theater to do her own show with the male singing group Ray Goodman and Brown. As the new owner, Guy decided to sit in the theater and watch Millie and her guest stars rehearse. Guy and his older brother Coco, now referred to as Sekou, took a seat in the front of the theater. When they walked into the theater, they heard Millie cussing and shouting that she wanted to speak to the owner of the theater. Guy stood up from his seat and walked over to the stage asking what was wrong. Millie replied that the theater was cold and she needed the heat to be turned up and that she wanted to speak to the owner. Again, now. All Guy could do was smile and asked if there was anything else she wanted. Millie answered by saying, "I need to see the owner of this Emma Effa." David McCarthy, the man Guy had kept on as the manager from the previous owners, came into the theater, stood next to Guy and his brother, and asked Millie what the problem was. This time, Millie said she was tired of asking to speak to the owner. David looked at Guy and his brother and then introduced them as the new owners. All she could do was laugh, and when she stopped laughing, Guy told David to turn up the heat and keep the lighting on for as long as Miss Jackson wanted the damn lights and the damn heat to be on. From that day in 1978 up until now, Millie Jackson is someone Guy Fisher both loves and respects. In Guy's own words, owning the Apollo Theater, I met so many good people. I also met a lot of shitheads and a handful of con men and con women, all of whom couldn't wait to get out of my office after I told them to get the F out and take their BS somewhere else. After several meetings with several so-called con men and women, I let them all know that if they ever tried to cheat me, the reality of the consequences would be an ugly situation for them. I never had any more problems with con artists. The one thing I learned as a street hustler on the streets of New York City is that when people come at you with larceny in their hearts, all you have to do is test them by questioning their sincerity concerning whatever it is they are trying to ask you to invest in. The moment you agree that their investment sounds good and say you might be interested and willing to invest money, that is when they begin to relax. The moment you agree or go above the amount they wanted you to invest, their larceny wheels start spinning. The second thing I learned is that most men or women whose hearts are rooted in larceny live their lives by word of mouth. They are good at talking and lying, but the thought of being in a life-threatening situation is an entirely different game for them. The list of good people I met at the Apollo is endless. At the opening, I met Debbie Allen, Patti LaBelle, Patty Austin, Bobby Humphrey, Paul Simon, Esther Roll, and many more. A few weeks after Ralph McDonald opened the theater, I received a visit from Barry Hankerson, who is now the owner of a record company and who was the uncle of the late talented singer and actress, Aaliyah. At the time of meeting Barry Hankerson in my office at the theater, he was accompanied by his wife, who at the time was Gladys Knight, the phenomenal female singer for the group Gladys Knight and the Pips. Meeting Gladys was an honor. Our meeting focused on Barry offering to take over the theater and bring his music business experience to the Apollo. When the meeting was over, I was happy to have been personally introduced to Gladys Knight, but at that specific time, I wasn't ready to relinquish my theater to anyone. Even though I lacked the experience and protocol expected in dealing with agents from record companies and managers of individual artists or groups, I had money, and I was not afraid to talk to anyone about their acts performing at the Apollo. Of course, having money and being unknown were not synonymous in the entertainment business, so I used a four-letter word that started with an F and ended with a K and said F protocol. My brother Sekou and I had a meeting with David McCarthy, who, as I stated before, was the manager of the theater when it was owned by the previous owners. As the new owner, I kept all the past workers, especially because they were black. And as a result of not firing them, I automatically gained their respect. At this meeting, I had him tell me about all the people who had appeared at the theater in the past that he respected for their professionalism as entertainers. He told me that Smokey Robinson was one of the nicest people he had ever met at the Apollo Theater. He also said that Smokey had been the last person to perform on stage before the theater closed 3 years ago. Apparently, while Smokey was performing, several gunshots were fired by a man in one of the old-fashioned booth seats of the theater. The gunshots caused Smokey and his entire band to run for cover. The shooting left one man deceased and another man wounded. That was the last time the Apollo Theater would be opened or owned by a white man. As I listened to David speak on his respect for Smokey Robinson, I told my brother that the two of us were going to talk to Smokey personally. I had David contact Smokey and arrange for us to speak with him. I explained to Smokey that the theater was now black owned and that we would deeply appreciate him coming to the Apollo to perform. At first, he was a little apprehensive. But when I assured him that he wouldn't have to worry about any violence of any kind, he agreed to come back to the Apollo and perform. The vast majority of entertainers in the music business who do live shows always have a rider in their contract, which means they require personal accommodations like bottles of water, a telephone in their dressing room, and other so-called necessities. Smokey Robinson didn't have a rider. His only request was to have some fresh fruit in his dressing room. I arranged to have a huge basket of assorted fruit, juices, and bottled water waiting for him in his room, and I had a male valet seated outside to be at Smokey's beck and call the entire time he was there. Shortly after having Smokey at the theater, a Jamaican friend of mine by the name of Derek Forrest, whom everyone called Pharaoh, arranged for my brother and I to meet with Don Taylor. Don Taylor was a direct associate of the world-famous Jamaican reggae star Bob Marley. We met with Don in New York and consummated a deal to bring Bob Marley to the Apollo Theater. 3 days before Bob Marley would appear on the Apollo Theater stage, my brother Sekou and I went to his hotel suite and was introduced to him by Don Taylor. The four of us sat down and talked. I immediately liked Bob's down-to-earth demeanor and his conversation, which focused on the endearment of the people as a whole. He talked about respect in terms of treating people the way he himself wanted to be treated. Bob told my brother and I that he had traveled around the world and had met millions of people who showed him love and respect. He said he had met people who were very poor and people who were very rich, but never once had he forgotten his meager beginnings in his beloved Jamaica. We spoke to Bob about how hard it was to get asked to appear at the Apollo now that it was black owned. Bob shook his head and said that he knew about that. Don Taylor had told him that we were the first blacks to own the theater. We stayed in Bob's suite no less than 2 hours talking. For me, it was a day that made me feel good about purchasing the Apollo. Bob asked if we smoked ganja, marijuana. I didn't smoke, but my brother did. Bob then got up from the living room couch and had my brother follow him into the bedroom. When the two of them returned to the living room, my brother had a big-ass smile on his face, and his eyes were squinted in such a way that it made him look as if there were Chinese ancestors in our family. On the drive from Bob Marley's hotel suite back to the theater, my brother was still smiling. He said he had just smoked the best marijuana in his life. Then he pulled out a baggie filled with ganja. As my thoughts run back in time, I have a big smile on my face thinking about my brother. Bob Marley did what no other entertainer in the history of the Apollo Theater up until that time had ever done. He filled the seats with a 3-day and 3-night sellout audience, which consisted of equal numbers of black and white people, all of whom loved and respected the king of Jamaican reggae. The Bob Marley Show also allowed me to meet two beautiful people, Betty Wright and Belinda Wilson. For anyone who doesn't know Miss B, which is what everyone calls Betty Wright, who was the hit singer of the song Clean Up Woman and several others, she was the opening act for Bob Marley. Betty opened the show with several songs, and after her last song, she received a standing ovation. Before starting his show, Bob Marley came out and sat on the stage with a microphone and said, "If I, Bob Marley, can come to this theater and be heard, everybody whose music has touched people can come here and be heard." The meaning of his statement was understood by everyone in the theater. Bob was telling black entertainers that there was nothing wrong with giving back to the people who have supported them. Ralph McDonald and friends, Smokey Robinson, Bob Marley, and Betty Wright broke the ice when they appeared at the now renowned black-owned Apollo Theater. Before the appearance of Smokey Robinson, Bob Marley, and Betty Wright, I had reached out to Teddy Pendergrass. At the time, Teddy was a sorry-ass Negro. I realized that he would be confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life, which is something I wouldn't wish on any human being under any circumstances. But at the time of Teddy's reigning success as a singer, he was a complete shithead as far as I was concerned. Anyway, I had the manager of the theater make arrangements for him, myself, and my brother to fly to Houston, Texas, where Teddy Pendergrass was doing a concert. On the night of the show, we waited backstage for Teddy to finish. When the show was over, the three of us waited patiently outside of Teddy's dressing room for our turn to talk to him for no more than 5 minutes. We watched as several people came and went from his dressing room. After what seemed like an hour of waiting, one of Teddy's proteges came out and told us Teddy would be right with us. The protege remained outside the dressing room with us, talking to us and asking miscellaneous questions. After what seemed like another hour, my brother and I started getting impatient. I told the protege to go back in the dressing room and tell Teddy we were leaving. He entered the dressing room and came out with a surprised look on his face saying, "Teddy is gone. He must have left through the other dressing room door." I wanted to punch this protege in his mouth because I knew that he knew all along that Teddy was going to sneak out the back. Seeing the look on my face, my brother came over to me and said, "It isn't worth it, Fishman," which was the nickname that only my brother called me. I nodded my head and we left and headed back to our hotel rooms. The following afternoon, when we were about to leave and catch our flight back to New York, David McCarthy suggested that we stop at Teddy's hotel. I didn't want to, but Dave said that the hotel was in the same direction as the airport and it wouldn't be out of the way. So we stopped at Teddy's hotel. As soon as we walked into the lobby, Dave spotted one of Teddy's security guards. Dave started talking to him, but I quickly interrupted and told the security guard, who was a black man, that I felt totally disrespected by Teddy's actions the night before. I told him that if Teddy didn't want to perform at the Apollo, all he had to do was say he didn't want to do it. I explained that I felt disrespected because if a white theater owner had flown into Houston, Texas from New York to talk to Teddy, I'm sure he would have shown him the decency of talking to him face to face instead of sneaking out the back door. Teddy's chief of security told me he would be right back with Teddy. No more than 3 minutes later, Teddy Pendergrass, his chief of security, and his manager stepped out of the elevator and into the hotel lobby. The three of them walked over to where we were standing. Dave introduced us as the owners of the Apollo Theater. There was no handshaking. I just started talking to Teddy about doing 3 shows at the theater. As soon as he asked me if he would be safe playing at the Apollo, I smiled. I smiled the type of smile that questioned whether Teddy Pendergrass was really from Philly. I quickly told him that the theater was now completely black-owned. I owned the theater, and he would never have to worry about anything happening to him in my house. My directness caused Teddy to respond by saying, "Well, if I do the shows, you're going to have to send me $50,000 up front." I told him if he was going to do the shows, I would send him the money the next day. Teddy said he really didn't need any money, but this was his way of getting out of having to perform. I told him I didn't need any money either, and that he wasn't doing me any favors. By coming to the theater, he would be giving a chance to all the people of Harlem who supported him, a chance to see him live. Teddy then told me to talk to his manager, and I told him to have his manager talk to my manager, David McCarthy. Teddy did not come to the theater right away. He came after Bob Marley. When Teddy did finally appear on stage, people booed him midway through the show. They booed him because they knew he didn't want to be there. Back in those days, whenever he performed, he had a towel wrapped around his neck, and at a certain point during his show, he would throw the towel into the crowd. The women would go wild. They would run toward the towel and fight for possession of it. But on this particular night at the theater, when Teddy threw the towel, no more than 2 women went after it. And that's when he made the mistake of saying, "I don't need to be here." Well, why did he say that? People started booing him and telling him to get off the stage. Before the start of the second half of the show, Teddy had the chief of his security team walk onto the stage and say Teddy had a touch of laryngitis and wouldn't be able to continue. 1 hour after he refused to do the second show, a Brinks truck with 2 security guards delivered $29,000 to the Apollo Theater to cover the second show, but Teddy didn't do it. It is written that life is a bitch and then you die. Well, shortly after being booed at the Apollo, Teddy went to New Jersey to do a show, and his show flopped. From that point forward, his career started going downhill, and several months later, he would be involved in a very serious car accident. After Teddy's appearance, dozens of other entertainers, Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, for one, would come forth and perform. I decided to make this video because there's always been whispers that Guy Fisher owned the Apollo, that Nicky Barnes owned the Apollo, that the council owned the Apollo. But Guy Fisher, when he wrote his book, he put this is an excerpt from that book. So there was never much details behind the purchase of the Apollo and a black man owning the Apollo. But I thought that was information worth being known. I will continue with another part of Guy Fisher's experience at the Apollo in my next video. Ciao for now.